too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraud, and I'm back to you with It's Not Just in Your Head. Me and Max Golding are happy to be doing this podcast and really very glad that we've gotten feedback. We didn't have time to ask this reader whether we could use his email on the air, so we're reading it without his name. But we want to respond to a thoughtful response we got from It's Not Just in Your Head. Take it, Max.
Okay, so here is the email we received. It says, "Hi, Max and Harriet. I personally enjoyed the Angie Speaks discussion because sometimes debate is a good thing to do. I think occasional guests who bring some adamant viewpoint is good for the show, though please don't make that a regular thing. It would be too much. Some topics I wonder if you two can dive into are about divided and in parentheses white families that are losing or lack authentic solidarity within themselves. My nuclear family has a conservative, diehard capitalist father, single-issue mother and sister, liberal brother, and myself a democratic socialist. We tend to ignore these divisions, and the family solidarity just seems lacking to me. I'm not sure if either Max or Harriet have experience talking to patients with similar experiences, but I think helping more white families bridge their internal divides over community, socialism, capitalism, whatever, could be an interesting topic that gets more progressive white people looking internally and into their own lives. And I think this ties into mental health quite a bit too, because several family members seem to isolate themselves from sharing themselves fully with the family. They say they're depressed or too stressed, and I believe this stress and depression might be connected to my father running a medium-sized company ineffectively and my mother working under exhausting conditions in an elementary school classroom and my brother being too distraught over the family rejecting his politics and values. A specific question I might ask for thoughts on is, how do ideologically mixed white families start to rebuild their own mental health, and can doing that be a useful starting place to help build a better, diverse, integrated community outside the white family? Hope the line of thought I am attempting to trace makes sense. Let me know if I can clarify the question. It doesn't have to be just about white families, but that's what I have experience with. And my other progressive white friends often have divides within their families too. I think it may be a pattern. And before you answer, Harriet, I do actually want to say that I have a feeling that this is not like a white people exclusive thing.
No, it isn't.
I almost feel like it should be we should have a generalized answer to it. But anyway, there you go.
I think so too, because in my experience as a therapist with diverse people, this is a very widespread experience with immigrants, with people of color. This is a modern problem with the family, although families have never been the hallmark card ideal that's been depicted. You know, anyone who has had to read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn in school, which is most of us, those books by Mark Twain, probably remember that Huckleberry Finn left his father, who in drunken episodes tried to kill him, and that Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn joined the tens of thousands, if not millions, of runaway children in the United States of the 1800s who had run away from abusive families or run away from abusive apprenticeships, because it used to be that people who had no money sent their boys out to apprenticeships to learn a trade, blacksmithing, carpentry, that kind of thing. And girls from poor families were sent to be personal servants to wealthy families. So that family togetherness was over by about 13, because the kids were sent out to be supported by someone else and learn some kind of a trade. For girls, a domestic trade. For boys, various trades like carpentry, shoemaking, and so on. And that children were always oppressed, that in fact they used to be even more oppressed than they are now. However, the question that was asked by our listener is, what are these divides that people are experiencing, and why are they coming, and what can be done about it? Well, I think that probably if you took an honest poll of American young adults, you would find that most of them are alienated from their families of origin, whether they're Hispanic or Black or anything else. And that's because a lot of families don't want to interrupt their family occasions, whatever they are, with rage and fighting. So they stay away from anything meaningful. They stay away from politics. They stay away from their personal lives because they don't trust each other enough to divulge those things. They stay away from a lot of social and political topics that would alienate members of the family, which means they have very little to talk about. I mean, I came from a family that shared my politics to some extent, and yet the emotional quality was so empty. I always left family events thinking, is that all? It was so lonely because people didn't communicate on any kind of an honest level. Because most people are not trained to be honest with themselves or anybody else. And so the honesty they can possibly achieve is with emotional or sexual partners and deep friends. And family really started being an outmoded institution when work was taken out of the household and brought into the workplace. Really, it's interesting that Freud didn't write his theories that involved incest in family life and various predations in family life, as well as other things, until the family system of production was already breaking down. In terms of what's happening to families today, I think families today are particularly in trouble. It's interesting, what's happened politically is that in 1965, Patrick Moynihan wrote a report called, quote, The Negro Family. And he talked about how the Negro family, calling Black people Negroes, is a pathological institution because Black families are often on welfare or other forms of aid because they have more unmarried mothers and because they commit more crimes relative to their population. That was in 1965, and he was trying to blame the problems of Black families on individual pathology of their members. Then Charles Murray, in 2012, he's the one who wrote The Bell Curve, a right-wing ideologue, wrote Coming Apart, The State of White America, where he talked about white families that are increasingly in poverty, needing assistance, getting divorced, having unwed mothers, etc. And he blamed that on the laziness and moral ineptitude of white fathers. It's always blaming something else rather than the social conditions that have, and the economic conditions that inform families now. And families now are in particular trouble. The United States has the highest divorce rate in the world, and it's highest in the evangelical communities, places like Utah and the South and the Midwest. And there it's the highest because people are encouraged to be asexual outside of marriage and only allowed within the mores of evangelical religious orthodoxy to have sex within marriage. So they get married very young and then realize they don't like each other and get divorced. In the United States, more than half of families and marriages end in divorce, 50%. And that doesn't count the another 15, 20% of people without money to fight over, or without kids to fight over, or possessions to fight over, who just split, make an arrangement with each other, and then split without bringing the legal system into their personal decisions. And so that it's obviously not individual pathology that creates these problems among families. And younger generations often have a different perspective from that of their parents who grew up in a different America. The United States is in a period of huge transition. Family life has changed in the United States. 75% of kids live without their original biological families. A statistic that brought it home to me was that in 1970, the United States had a divorce rate of, where is this? Yeah, of about 25-30%. Now they have a divorce rate of 50% plus another 20%, let's say, or 15% of marriages that dissolve on their own. And so that this is a big change. Also, in the last 50 years, single parenthood has emerged because men can't support their children. Blue-collar men can't really get family wages anymore as a group and can't support dependent wives and children. And women increasingly don't want to marry. It's now the majority of women who are the people who decide that they don't want to marry rather than men, and women who initiate divorces. Among college-educated people, 70% of divorces are initiated by women. Among non-college educated women, it's still a majority of the people getting divorced are women. And that's because the old family form was dependent on whites being a majority in this country, which they're not now. Well, they still are a slim majority, but that's changing. And dependent on a white family wage, because unions and workers who were mainly white until the 1970s fought for, struck for, and won family wages for white blue-collar workers who were able to then provide for dependent wives and children. And their wives worked as full-time domestic servants for them. They cooked, they cleaned, they did childcare, they did elder care, they provided for their husband's sexual needs and for care of their relatives and for social connection, inviting people over, keeping connected with relatives, and so on. Now that almost half of women were in the labor force, at least before the pandemic, women don't want to come home after working outside the home and do the second shift of taking care of husbands. And although men have increased their share of domestic labor, it's nowhere near the share that's borne by women of all colors and nationalities that are in the United States now. And so marriage has broken down. In 1970, 11% of children were born outside of a marriage. That's the figure. Whereas in 2019, it was 42%. And although that's higher among minorities, it's pretty high among everyone. So that the whole idea of having a child outside of marriage is acceptable now, as it was shameful, considered shameful in the 1970s. Because, marriage has broken down. Most kids, once they're 6 years old, and certainly by 11, come home to a house where nobody's home because they're either their single parent or both parents are out working. It's a whole different ballgame for childhood. And the ideas that are based on the eternal family and a steady job that lasts you a lifetime, they're gone. Precarity is the rule. People get married later. More and more people don't bother getting married. And if they do get married, the biggest increase in marriage types is marriage without children, because children are very expensive and very difficult when two people have to work, and they need a support structure that Americans don't have. And so people gathered around a family occasion see life very differently. They don't expect the permanence their parents did. They don't have the sense that they will have a steady job that lasts a lifetime and be able to support other people on their wage. They don't have a sense of a long-term marriage. They don't know if they're going to have children. It's not what it was. And so they're living in different worlds, and each doesn't necessarily want to face that or face that in themselves, which makes it hard to communicate. Not that families ever communicated on a deep level. Another thing that would address the questions raised by our thoughtful listener is the fact that Americans now identify their problems in life as psychological. Their identities, as we have talked about too much on this program, according to feedback, but their identities are not wrapped up as I am a working class person, I am an owning class person, but on I am a person of color, I am a woman, I have these and so psychological problems. The therapeutic discourse has dominated people's ideas of who they are. And so that our expectations of family occasions are expectations of a kind of emotional depth of communication, which other generations don't share, and make it very difficult for these honest conversations to happen. You know, I remember just in my own personal experience when me and my husband went to visit my parents and were having dinner with them. My husband, as mainly a joke, said at the dinner table to my parents, "You two are so lucky that your daughter is a therapist, so she can help you understand what's going on in your family." To which my parents, after rolling their eyes at each other, said nothing, because that was so out of order that it was unmentionable. And those are huge divides. And what we expect of a family is not going to come from a family. People get their emotional nurturance mainly from their peers rather than their families. And so if we have an expectation that going home will have this depth of honesty and communication, we're always disappointed, because that's just not happening anymore. And the reason it's not happening, and the reason that all the markers of pain are out there, whether they're the pain of divorce, the pain of not having two parents, the pain of not having money, the pain of being in foster care, the pain of committing suicide, the pains of addiction, they've all soared as the United States is now the most unequal country of all the industrial nations, whereas in 1970 we were the most egalitarian of all the industrialized nations. And so that there's been a sea change in family life, because the conditions of existence for family life, which were family wages, have changed. Everyone has to work now. Both parents are working. That's a huge change. It's a difference between 11% of children born to overwhelmingly a single mother, and 42%. And most children, 75%, living with different people from the ones from whom they were born. Our whole personal lives have had a shift. And just as Moynihan made the criticism that the Black family was pathological, that's why there was more unemployment and that's why there was more crime and so on, that has happened with white families now. Black men could never get a family wage. And part of being defined as a man was, I am a man, I support my family. Well, they couldn't. And so they tended to desert families a whole lot more readily because they couldn't live up to what the society defined as a good partner and a good man. They didn't have the economic base for that. And now the mass of Americans don't have the economic base for that. And so they are also lost, and they also don't have that foundation of a family. Also, we should remember that those families that stayed together were not necessarily staying together because they had such a deep and wonderful relationship, but rather because divorce was considered a shame on the family, and also because women had no option to raise children on their inferior wages. Now, women still do get inferior wages. We get 82% of what men get for similar work, and 43% of women work in pink-collar trades, which are the poorest paid. So, we still don't have the conditions of existence for real equality. But this, in 1960, 65, women got 59 cents of the male dollar instead of 82%. That's a big difference. And also we have abortion and birth control on a level we didn't because the pill wasn't invented and then was not available. And birth control was forbidden for single women until late into the 60s, and for married women until the early 60s. So there's huge changes. Both the women's movement and the economy have prevented families from being what they were, which was never great shakes, but it certainly was a firmer basis than what people have now. So if people go home expecting this depth and cohesion when they go home, the majority will be deeply disappointed. And it's only the Hallmark card version or the evangelical focus on families that touts that idea when it's really outmoded. So that would be our response. And I would just want to add one thing, that the family, the isolated nuclear family, has been promoted as if it is an eternal human phenomenon. That isn't true at all. The earliest families were tribes that raised children together, the earliest cave people and prehistoric people. Even the Native Americans, when the settlers got here in the 1600s, had much different family arrangements. Among the Iroquois, women, also the earlier people, women were much more equal because they needed everybody to equally help work and also help share the proceeds of their work. And so that the maternal uncle and the mother were the primary parents, but everyone was to chip in because the children were the future of the tribe. And that has changed. The 1950s family is still promoted as if it's real, but it's completely outmoded. And even the 1950s family was not the greatest. As a woman who is old, I certainly know that looking around at families. But parents stayed together, however unhappily they did stay together. At any rate, I want to thank our listener for sending in his request, which applies not only to white families, but all American families who are going through a huge transition. And also say, don't worry if your family can't communicate with each other. You're lucky if there's one person with whom you can be close in your family. And a lot of parents put pressure on their children to be close in the family, to think of the family as this oasis. But really, it never was much of an oasis, and now it's even less of one. I wonder, Max, you're so much younger than I. What was your experience? Was it different from mine?
In this context of like family and
Yeah,
maybe
family as a
ideological
basis.
differences and
Yes.
everything. Yeah, I mean, I shared, really early on in the podcast, just, I was raised by pretty kind of evangelical parents. And so, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this because I've reflected on this a lot over the years, and especially with, well, let me actually start here. So anyone who's familiar with Jane McAlevey, pretty renowned like labor organizer who's been doing the talking circuits, a term that she's started to use a lot is the self-selecting model of activism, where we, no matter what your ideological viewpoint is, you will self-select for other people who share the same ideology, and then you do some sort of activist stuff. And her sort of advice to people that want to get more into the labor and union organizing world is to actually abandon self-selection and to start expanding outside of that. And so that got me really thinking a lot over the last several years of activism that I had been doing. And so that makes me think of family, because in family is sort of the original non-self-selecting model. You're just born into a family, and you don't get to choose anything that anyone in your family believes. You're just born into it, right? And so
Yeah.
I think there's a really big challenge that you have in that we are the complexity of a globally financialized capitalist world in any country in that context, where every family and every kid and every school and every neighborhood and every community is being bombarded actually by competing narratives about how the world works, how the world should be. They're being bombarded with advertisements that are peddling lies about everything just to sell things. So I think most human beings in any sort of industrialized society, we're actually all, I think, probably very, well, I'll say this too. So I think, because I don't think there's an easy solution to this. Like if you are in a family where there's like 5 different ideological viewpoints, and there's some subtle differences, but then there's just totally stark sort of impasses where, like, if me and the other person really got into it, we'd probably hate each other because our values are so diametrically opposed, or something. It's just hard because I want to point to algorithms a little bit, but I don't think that's the totality of it. I mean, that if you have one parent who is like addicted to Fox News or just right-wing social media, and then you have somebody who, I mean, if you found our podcast, that means your algorithms are probably relatively socialist. Like you have stuff, coming into your newsfeed or whatever that's of that nature. I think maybe this is a little bit direct advice, I guess, to anyone that finds this troubling, is that, like, so if you think that in the activist or organizing world, that moving away from a self-selecting model and toward, like, let's get everyone in a workplace or an apartment building or in a neighborhood on the same page, you have to accept, first of all, that if you want to do that kind of organizing work, you have to be able to tolerate ideological difference, because in a workplace or a neighborhood or an apartment building or whatever, you're actually going to find extraordinary diversity of ideological views. And you have to start from the point of listening, almost like a therapist. This is what, like, any union organizer will train you to do. So you listen 80%, you talk 20%. So imagine in your family, you're actually trying to bombard people with, like, well, here is why Marx was right, or here is why Bernie Sanders is the guy, or something. That's just never going to win anybody over. I think if you actually started from a point of curiosity, of asking the conservative or the sort of, like, neo-lib mom person, whoever. It's like, I think Kamala Harris is going to do a great job because she's a black woman or something, that you actually just ask open-ended, curious questions to these people in your family and say, oh, I have a different view, but I'm just curious why, what do you think? What do you think Kamala Harris will do that, Mike Pence didn't do? Or if somebody thinks, I know Trump, I know people don't like his straight talk, but he's really, those tariffs are what we need. Oh, well, where can you tell me more? I actually haven't looked into the tariffs thing. It's really hard. I'm not great at this, but I aspire to be great at this. I think if you find kind of what's valid, the little grains of that, oh, well, that makes sense. That's a good point. Yeah. Or if you just even admit well, I don't really know how tariffs work. Maybe I should look that up, instead of just being I'm right and my ideological viewpoint is correct. I do also think that in the ideal situation, what families could do is, this would almost be like a support group or therapy group or something, where everyone sits down and they just share a couple things. One would be how are they socialized to believe what they believe? Because there's a lot of us have a chip on our shoulder about we were just born into some ideological set of views, and that's just bullshit. Nobody was. That's not true. We've been taught things. So where did you learn what you believe? And I think if everyone just sort of shared that, it could humanize things a bit, and it would make more sense. Oh, okay, well, you experienced that and that thing, and you went to that school, or you read that book, or your closest friends believed in that thing, or maybe you experienced, bullying or meanness in a certain group of ideologically driven people, and you've just avoided that ideology for the rest of your life. That, I think, that would be totally humanizing. So there's that. And the other final thing is actually examining the assumptions that people make. If you have a conservative, so really sort of Bible bumper evangelical, you have a sort of generic liberal, and you have just a politically, they don't care, they're apathetic politically. And you just were able to figure out what are the base level assumptions about how they think the world should be, what the purpose of humanity is, or something like that, you'd probably get closer to a point of understanding. And if you can understand the other person, they're a little bit more likely, I think, to be curious about understanding you. But I guess to close this up on my end, I don't know if it's the healthiest goal. I guess this is just my opinion. The healthiest goal to try to bring sort of ideological unity within families, just because I don't know how realistic that is. I do think that if it's a point of serious contention, here's another way to put it. If you're, if you identify so strongly, if you're I'm a communist, I'm a democratic socialist, I'm a whatever. And especially with the online left these days, there's all, anarcho-syndicalist. It's stuff that you really have to be really deep down entrenched in the rabbit hole of reading into left theory stuff to actually use these terms.
Yeah.
But if you really, really, really strongly identify, as if it's your identity with these sort of ideological views. I mean, I sort of identify as a Marxist, but it's more there's just certain ideas and concepts that I think make sense that I'm happy to explain to people, but I'm not I don't care that much. I'm not, if someone's I'm anti-Marxist, I don't feel like they've attacked me or something. I actually don't care. I think another thing is that if anyone's just identify the totality of who you are as this ideological viewpoint, that might be something to try to soften a little bit. Cause we've talked about this. As human beings, we're a lot more complex than just one thing or two things. We're the totality of a whole lot of things, and we're constantly all changing. I think human beings are much more clay than they are glass. And so in that same way, other people might sort of shift ideologically as well if you seem friendly and nice to them. But
yeah,
it's a hard goal to have, to change people's minds. So
it is also for a lot of families. If somebody says, let's all talk about where we learned our approach to politics, or our people would think, huh? What? They would not know where to begin because they're not used to that kind of discussion, and
Yeah.
you would be considered a weirdo.
Yeah,
And
probably.
like I, it's a psychological approach that, and an individual approach that requires self-examination, which is not necessarily something that a lot of people do in families.
Yeah.
And so that I think the whole approach is a wonderful one if the people in the family would entertain that rather than think there's a weirdo,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Right.
And
Well, that's yeah. Yeah.
I remember the contrast. My son had a good friend up the street who was kind of a tough kid. His mother obviously didn't like him or anything. He always used to hang out at our house. And my son and he had some argument. And he said, I'm leaving. And he started storming out the door. And my son said to him, Antonio, you can't leave without working this out. And Antonio turned around and said, huh? Like, what? It's another universe. And I think there are often different universes at the same table. So that, and also that our experiences, younger people have a psychological identification, I think, to often a destructive extent, because they don't allow for the economic, social, and political forces. However, people blame themselves for their failure and talk about, I shouldn't have done this, or I should have done that, or my family was this. And that's a completely different orientation from the orientation of an older person who feels differently about that. And so
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there are these divides. People would really have to try to get, as you suggested, Max, not only the question, but into the universe from which the question emerged.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I think, typically this is a bit of a simplification, but I think mostly accurate, that what we really mean when we talk about left versus right is it has to do with sort of less or more hierarchy and democracy, meaning on the right, there's typically an acceptance or a belief, an assumption that hierarchy is somewhat natural and preferable, which would mean that in a family, within a family, for example, if you have, like, let's say a dad, typical nuclear family, you have a dad who just sort of believes that, like, well, if I make a rule, everyone has to follow it, kind of thing. If you have that individual or everyone within that family system just sort of believes that, that's what we would say is a relatively right-wing viewpoint. And so it is accepting of and assumes that there's just a sort of built-in hierarchy or order of things. And it's relatively anti-democracy in the sense that there's really we're not going to have a vote on what to have for dinner. We're not going to have collaboration or feedback. The king's going to sort of make the decision. On the left, we typically say, well, we don't think that kind of hierarchy is justified. Like, just because you say that you get to decide for everyone, right? That's not legitimate enough. Like, maybe if we elected dad as the as the representative of the family who can decide what for dinner or whatever, that's fine. And we typically believe in more democratization of institutions and whatever. Just whenever there's a larger group, we believe in a democratized process. So I think I'm bringing that into the mix as well, because I think this kind of on the bare bones level, if you've grown up in a family that's been more entrenched on one or the other side of that spectrum, it is going to be harder to introduce to somebody the idea, if they've been living their life their whole life, or let's say at work, they think the hierarchy thing and democracy isn't really necessary, and at work they found that things just work better. They're like, look, the boss just tells me what to do. there's no need for us to have this like collective bargaining crap or whatever. Like I do just fine, or they've decided that that's just too messy. The relationships, I don't want to sit through this stupid meeting and everyone complains for an hour and then we make a stupid decision together and so makes a shitty proposal and we have to debate the stupid proposal or whatever. I think there's a legitimate criticisms of democratized institutions, and we actually should be getting into like maybe not intense or mean debates, but we should actually have debates about that. Like, do we want that or do we not want that? But this also is at the heart of like, how do we actually think our democracy, if we actually do believe in democracy generally, if we even believe in representative democracy, if we think that the way that all the electoral maps are carved out in the United States are absolutely perfect the way they are and the way that the representative system works is the absolute best way it can be, then there's really nothing to debate. But I guess the other thing is that if you do want to bring this into a conversation, being somewhat informed, like I think being less knee jerk, like something that I saw, I think and this happens a little bit more in the identity realm, I think for understandable reasons, but sometimes people just want to sort of get into like a heated, they almost want to be a contrarian or something. Like if somebody says, I think Biden's doing a great job, and you just want to, and you don't want to roll your eyes at your parent and say like, you're such a neo-lib or some sort of thing. To me, that's just sort of like immature. Like you're not really, there's no way for you to educate someone or like come to any common agreement if you just want to like disagree with people in that way. So I don't know. There's my view on it.
Yeah. Also, I do think there's a problem. I mean, the left is anti-authoritarian and also often undisciplined because of it. But, the belief in an authority, even an elected one, can be difficult. And I think one of Max and my approaches here is we really are inviting your feedback because we don't say we're the authority, you have nothing to say, shut up and listen. We would like you to participate. And we believe in that, even though it does make things a little more messy when people are consulted than when they're not. I had an uncle who really wasn't at all interested in what his wife or his kids would say. And that was my father's best friend. So we visited them a lot, that uncle. And he would say, he was smart. He would say to his wife, if she introduced something, or his kids, I need this, like my ass, choose gum. Okay. So everybody got the idea. Nobody's ass needs to chew gum. Okay, time to shut up. And he'd say it in this booming voice that conveyed, I take up all the airspace. Don't interfere. And one does grow up with these authoritarian models and either rebel against them or try to imitate them. And that, a lot of that determines what goes on in a family. For most families, they want to pretend they get along, which means quashing everything and just talking about, oh, Aunt Mary got a new hat, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a sort of wisdom in that for some people in knowing that things are going to be really contentious if they don't keep it superficial, because there's clashes of values and perspectives to like a severe degree. So just to kind of name that, something else that just came to mind. I don't know why I didn't answer your initial question of what was it like. What was my experience in my family? I may be repeating myself from a year ago episode or something, but I went on a really deep dive in physical libraries. By the way, big fan for anyone who lives near a library. I went to the library and checked out a bunch of books in my mid-teens about the history of Christianity, because I did hit a point at which I think because of primarily education in two areas within high school. One was world religions and the other was biology class. World religions taught me about Buddhism, Hinduism, like all these things that my parents seemed to never tell me that there were other religions. And so when I started asking them questions, they were just like, well, that's sort of evil. Like God won't let you into heaven if you go toward that garbage or whatever. And I was like, okay, that's weird. And then in biology class, learning about evolution, and my dad being like, well, God put dinosaur bones on Earth or the devil put, I don't know, just weird,
Yeah.
like the really weird shit, like totally weird
Right.
shit. I just decided at a certain point, well, my parents have a pretty authoritarian and mean and whatever kind of way of, talking about almost anything, especially this thing that they're like, they literally kind of want to beat me into believing. And then there's these like nice educators who are just sort of like, well, here's the evidence and let's ask questions and let's discuss and whatever. And I thought, well, that actually makes a bit more sense. Then I thought, why don't I just go read books about the history of Christianity? And as I read all these books, I got stacks of books. There was on one level, I was rebelling against my parents because I finally was, it almost feels like, now I think of the equivalent as like if your boss tells you like you absolutely can't do this on your break or whatever, like you're just like, fuck you, I'm going to do this on my break.
Right.
I just decided I don't even believe you people anymore. You've just said so many inconsistent things. I'm going to go read on my own a wide diversity of perspectives on this. And then I found that, all kinds of just there's a book called The Jesus Mysteries that's about how, half of the most well-known stories from the New King James Bible are just sort of amalgamation mythologies taken from different pagan myths. And like, there were, tons of things like that. I read so many things that it finally dawned on me that like what my parents believe is one set of stories that actually was a sort of colonial tool to like colonize pagan Europe as a testing grounds before they did it to the rest of the world, like before the sort of the capitalist class did it. That's sort of my political analysis now. But I actually had to sort of depart from their worldview in that way because it actually was just false. Like it was patently false if you just looked into the history. And it was painful because when I tried to bring these things up to them, it was because their identities were so strongly linked to their particular Christian faith. It felt like I was abandoning them in a way, although I sort of felt it was the other way around. And so there's really never been a huge reconciliation to that effect. I think that's very common for a lot of people. I have a client right now who just came out as lesbian and is like also really Catholic. And if for some reason she finds this, sorry, I'm not identifying you, but I'm just sharing your story really briefly to say that she's having a huge reconciliation because she's like, Catholicism is about as strong as a part of her identity as being a lesbian at this point. But she's wrestling right now because she's found that when she tries to talk about this, she's found that people in the church are saying, well, yeah, you can't go to heaven if you live that lifestyle. And she's having to decide, like, do I choose being a lesbian? Do I choose being a Catholic? Is there a way to be a Catholic lesbian that's not, because they're saying there's not, so that stuff's really hard.
It is hard because also I think we're trained to be the emotional barometers of our parents' weather. And so if we say something and they answer with a defensive finitude, you don't want to continue to question them because they're telling you it frightens me and hurts me if you go there. Because we learn to survive by picking up the emotions of our parents with the considerable brain cells that we have that respond to the emotions around us, the mirror neurons. And so, a typical example for me is that I knew I wanted to get out of my family. Having been a foster child with different relatives, I realized, whoa, I want to get away from all these people, live with other kids. And I asked my mother if I could go to boarding school when I was in high school. And she said, boarding school is for children whose parents don't want them. In other words, I am threatening her status as a mother by even requesting that. And I could feel her fragility and therefore didn't bring it up again. Because I think, although a lot of parents don't see their children as people with emotional needs, children do see their parents that way and learn for survival reasons to pick up the emotions of our parents. And it's only later when we start to leave home that we begin to dare to question. And we know not to dare to bring things up that cause rigidity born of terror. And that's so of religion also. So it's very hard because within the family system, you have these helpless creatures with tyrants brought up with these omnipotent people who don't know what they're doing. And it's not like we have a country like all the Scandinavian countries, France, and even Germany, where children go to childcare centers and have another experience and another set of values and a solidarity with other children. We're isolated with these people. And ever since Reagan vetoed the bill that would have allowed Head Start for all American children, we've never come close again to doing what every sophisticated European country has, an alternative to the nuclear family, a place to relieve parents and allow children to be with educated carers and other children, which gives one a completely different perspective. And that America is terribly backward in our family care. And it's sad that Biden's infrastructure bill has been pared down by the Republicans, with some collusions by the Democrats, I should say, at least I'll explain that later what I mean, has meant that the caring infrastructure part of the infrastructure bill has been dropped, and it's only bridges and highways that will be covered, and not families and caring labor, which is a blow to feminism and to all women's work. One of the reasons that so many women have dropped out of the labor force during the pandemic is because personal labor is allocated to women. We're the nurses, we're the daycare workers, we're the people who run the after-school programs. We are the nurses' aides. We're the geriatric health aides, which are all lower paid because they're part of the caring labor associated with women's labor in the household. But that, I don't want to lose track here that we depend on these caregivers and we know how important it is that we agree with them. And so our survival depends on pleasing them. And it's only when we begin to transition out of those households that we know that we can even have permission to think differently. That's part of the terrible backwardness of American families and part of why our families are in such terrible trouble compared to the families of countries like France and Germany and, all the Scandinavian countries, which create an alternative to the nuclear family for children and therefore liberate both parents and children and allow families to do better, as well as they have, of course, paid vacations and family leave that allow parents to be able to work outside the home and still feel okay to be with their children instead of torn and conflicted and overburdened. Same with the medical care we don't provide. So we have a lot of, while we tout family as more important than any of these other countries, we do less to allow it. And the right wing is particularly terrible in that they don't support family leave, paid vacations, and other things that allow families to survive without terrible pressure that drives them apart. And so, we are part of the failing families of the United States, which is a psychological, political, social phenomenon, and an economic one as well.
Yeah. Well, shall we?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you, listener, for that feedback. And we really did, because we were getting a lot of emails, and now we don't get as much. We get some chatter in the Discord by patrons, but we really do want more emails. We also We have like a little anonymous, like if you want to just give feedback anonymously for some reason, that's fine too. But just the more feedback, the better, to help us kind of shape the direction of the podcast. So if you want to email us more comments, questions, reactions, suggestions, I don't know if I said that word. It's not, or what is it? It's not just in your head at gmail.com. And also, I forgot in the beginning to say this, to a big thank you to our patrons,
Absolutely.
First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila MC Manga. And as always, Liam, thank you for the editing and the social media.
Yes, and we are non-authoritarian people. So we want your feedback and invite your participation and are very grateful for it.
Well, I'm an authoritarian. No, I'm just kidding.
I say it's time to end the show, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's right. Okay, boss, you got it.
I'm right. Nobody's wrong.
Okay, boss, you got it.
Okay.
Take care.
Right. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.